The President of the Human Rights Commission, Professor Gillian Triggs, presided over today's hearing. She's leading the Commission's national inquiry into children in detention and has visited Christmas Island Detention Centre twice this year as part of that inquiry. Gillian Triggs, welcome to 7:30.
Thank you.
Now, last night on this programme, the Minister said that your claims about the levels of sickness and mental distress of children in detention centres and on Christmas Island were sensational and wrong. What's your response to that?
Well, my response is to say that I'm relying on the evidence and the facts. And today's public hearing, the third we've now held as part of this inquiry into children in detention, confirms over and over again from the paediatricians, the psychiatrists, even the director of the mental services for those detention centres, every witness and every submission, almost every submission we're receiving, corroborates those facts as being accurate. So the objective of this inquiry is to get to the truth, and I think we are getting closer and closer to it.
Just a few specifics, particularly in the area of the mental distress. In terms of the evidence today, was there evidence that children had tried to poison themselves?
There was. We asked witnesses, could they give us examples of self-harm or attempted suicides, and one of the examples was drinking detergents. The headbanging was very common, jumping off heights. We heard others of plastic bags over the head, using the hijab to hang. I mean, there were example after example. With the children in particular, it's more taking dangerous risks, but in extreme cases, of course, cutting themselves with, and that can vary in extremity, as well as drinking poisonous or detergents and substances they can get their hands on.
So to be clear, that there are cases where a child or children have tried to poison themselves?
We heard evidence that corroborated that today.
So when the Minister says that that's sensational?
I'm afraid I believe that the Minister needs to be better advised.
Now, at the same time, Dr. Peter Young, who directs IHMS, the company responsible for the health of detainees, he gave evidence that the department had pushed back in relation to figures for depression and mental stress of children. Just explain his testimony and the effect it had on you.
Well, it was very powerful testimony because he was the director of the mental services that are being provided, so he's a highly credible person. And he was talking about the evidence that the incidence of mental illness among children is 30% higher than the incidence among children in the mental health delivery of services in Australia. That's a very, very powerful figure, and he provided that figure, as you would expect him to do, to the department, and he gave evidence that he was asked to withdraw those figures and to resubmit them in some more palatable way. That was very, very troubling and damning evidence.
And in relation to Dr. Young's testimony about the department's request to him to withdraw those figures, are there other examples where that level of secrecy or a desire to colour the facts? Have you come across anything like that before?
Well, we're coming across what you see as perhaps a manipulation of the circumstance. There seems to be, not only in terms of the public, clear refusal to provide information, but almost a systemic process within the department to keep these figures under some sort of wrap. They're not being analysed, they're not being considered. And then you get other stories that, for example, that certain children are to be selected to go to Nauru to create an impression that very, very young children are being sent there. We're seeing a sort of manipulation of the environment to create ultimately a deterrence. And
in relation to the physical illness, from the testimony of the paediatricians and the doctors who visited Christmas Island and the other detention centres, how do they compare to paediatric care in the general community?
Well, the paediatric, and we've taken a paediatrician or a child psychiatrist to every one of the visits, both throughout Australia and on Christmas Island. They are basically saying that the children are sick, and that the remoteness and the extremity of the circumstances is such that ordinary services just don't do it. They need much more than that. And so I think what they're doing is bringing their skills, obviously from an Australian perspective, and looking at with horror at exactly what's happening at in these other detention centres. So they are making comparisons with Australia. And then there's an occasion when they say, oh well, but it's remote. But you see, that's not an excuse. There's a duty of care to these children, and if you're placing them there in a mandatory environment in which their legal claims to refugee status are being ignored, and you're exposing them to these conditions and not giving them even average suburban Australian standards where they actually need much more than that, then of course the paediatricians and child specialists are becoming deeply concerned.
So in terms of what you heard today, again the Minister said last night that the children in the detention centres are provided care on a daily basis. Going on what you heard today, is that true?
It doesn't appear to be true on the evidence that we're receiving.
In relation to Nauru, there was an account of a sexual assault of a young man. We understand him to be 16 years old. Is Nauru a safe place for children?
Well, the evidence that we're receiving unequivocally is that it is a very unsafe place for children, unsafe for everybody, but all of the evidence is that for children it is particularly damaging. The conditions and the research very clearly demonstrating that children decline much more rapidly than adults do, but particularly so after 6 months, and that's really what's happening. We have them on Christmas Island more than a year, and many for that period in Nauru.
One of the remarks of one of the doctors stood out for me. She said that if a child was living in these conditions, this is in the general community in Australia, and suffering such distress, state authorities would remove that child. You've been to Christmas Island recently. How do you respond to that?
Well, I completely agree. I'm not a doctor, but as a lay person and a lawyer relying on medical evidence, I saw child after child that if that had been in my suburb where I live in Sydney, you would be asking the mother, what's going on? Why is this child not being treated? There were children with big lumps, untreated sores, red eyes, but most of them were coughing, had asthmatic conditions or stomach complaints. You would not tolerate that as a neighbour, as somebody meeting another person at a school environment. You'd be saying, what are you doing for that child? There, it's almost, it's endemic.
So what do you think should happen right now to those children in detention?
Well, I urge the Minister to release the children into Australian centres, proper initial assessments, whatever's appropriate, but get them out into community detention if necessary, or with their families on bridging visas. Get them out into the community, because a lot of damage is being done, and past history suggests that these children will be Australians in the future.
Gillian Triggs, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Sarah.